wave your hands and say, we've had enough MOOCs. I've reached my MOOC saturation point. I'm done with MOOCs. And on the fly, I'll talk about something else. But if you're up for it, we'll spend the next hour or so talking about MOOCs and more. One of the things that I liked about what Keith mentioned, there are lots of things, but one of them was this reference to the idea that MOOCs had some kind of common heritage with MMOs, with World of Warcraft and these great games. And here's a rather epic adventure that some probably 14-year-old kid is about to go vanquish, or maybe that's actually his avatar. I haven't played this game since I finished my doctorate, so I'm not playing anymore. But what I think is fascinating about what's happened in this space and lessons to learn from this space is kind of clearly identified by what you see in that interface. They are not trying to teach an individual player how to go and vanquish whatever that monster is, but they want to enwrap him or her in a narrative that really helps them understand why they would vanquish him, how they would vanquish him. All of these little buttons at the bottom are macros and gear and stuff that he's acquired over the course of the character's lifetime in order to go vanquish that. To do that, there are quests and projects and problems that he's had to solve in order to get to that place. So that whole notion of learning in a ubiquitous environment is really, really well captured here, to the point where millions of players play and spend hours and hours and hours of their day playing, and yet never have to learn to play. The whole process of leveling in these games, what they call the grind, is really developed to make it as entertaining and as interesting as possible. And they handle a lot of different pedagogies, our term. They wouldn't use that. But they handle a lot of different pedagogies in this, too. That monster and the world that he's involved in right now has an entire narrative to it. My son, who's 14, knows every aspect of this narrative. He was pretty severely dyslexic, and when he was little tiny, he and I would go out and vanquish monsters and in this game, and I would only kill the monster if he could read the name of the monster. If he couldn't read it, I died. I died a lot. But after spring break of us sitting in computers on either side of the room, and my dyslexic son having trouble with, and these are kind of mythological names. This game has a lot of Welsh, which is the easiest language for a dyslexic American kid to try to read. But by the end of it, he had actually saved his mom. I wasn't dying in the game anymore, and he could read the names of the monsters. His teacher sent me an email his first day back and said, "What were you doing? Whatever you were doing, keep doing it." And I was like, oh, I can't spend another 20 hours playing this game with him. But I'm glad it works. And I think that for as much as the rest of my conversation about MMOs, it's going to be a little bit of an autopsy, I'm afraid, of the last 3 that I've done, and maybe an interesting parody with some of the stuff that you saw with Keith. This world, we haven't realized yet. So I would hope in the next couple days, this is what we kind of get to, not necessarily this particular monster, but this idea. How do we kind of create environments that are this engaging and that don't hit you over the head with learning? It's not a forced march of learning. It's a real journey of discovery. So this is kind of roughly what we're going to talk about today. I've got 3 MOOCs that we're going to look at. 2 were formally in the edX platform, and 1 was in Canvas. So we'll counterpoint a little bit about those. I do mean the foxholes. We're going to go into really sexy things like budgets and how horrible the LMSs were. And I promise I'll try not to keep it boring. But let's start with what the promise was when I started the edX MOOCs. University of Texas was the first public institution as a system to join the edX consortium. So this was Harvard, MIT, roughly Berkeley at the time. And UT said, we have real challenges in Texas. We have massive scale challenges in Texas. This would be, at the very least, an experiment to see what this could mean for the institution. So we have an Institute of Transformational Learning. They actually brokered the deal at the system level, not on the campus level, and then gave out grants to the faculty. I was one of 3. There were 23 grant proposals that went in. They gave us like 2 weeks to try to turn them around. And I had 3 in that. 2 of them actually got accepted. But the first thing that happened when we got into edX was that we were immediately confronted with the dominant model of a university. So, for example, they really did approach us because they wanted, and the tagline used to be, you can go to archive.org and see what this used to be. It's not how they position it. edX doesn't position it now this way. But at the time, Anant Agarwal came in and he said, first thing, we're going to deliver the world's best education from the world's best universities, which immediately meant that other universities that I worked with globally were never going to participate. They were never going to be on the short list to be invited into this kind of new Ivy League of campuses. But it was an interesting idea. Here we have Harvard Yard. Anyone can walk onto Harvard Yard. You can just walk in. You can go into libraries. You can walk in. Can you actually participate as a student? Not so much. So because I have these nefarious gamer tendencies, I saw this and thought, well, are they trying to take over the virtual campus? Is that the intention? That they'll take the prestigious elite universities, they'll create the virtual ecosystem of those, and that will be where learning goes. What are our working universities do, our training and teaching colleges do? So these are the kinds of things I was wondering when we first started. Then immediately as we set up to enroll in the course, we had lots of pressure to get enrollment going out pretty quickly. One of the secrets to MOOCs that I've learned, and it's not often talked about, is the many, many months before that you can start enrolling, the higher you're going to get the really sexy numbers. So if you start 6 months in advance, a year in advance in your enrollment, you're going to get tens of thousands of people. Woohoo, big numbers. Looks massive. And so we had press to try to get enrollment out. There were other business reasons too. But the first stumbling block was that our course, the Take Your Medicine course I'm about to tell you about, didn't have a course number. At the University of Texas, numbers are meaningless. We have 3,000 courses every year, 301X whatever. That number is meaningless. No student remembers it when they're out of a course. Unless you're in an upper division or a seminar course, you probably wouldn't even talk about it with other students. You might say, that professor's signature course, but you wouldn't refer to it by number. Whereas on these campuses, the course number was a brand. The faculty member had such an identification with that course number that they just kind of assumed that we would too, that anybody else that participated would have a course number, and it was branded. So this actually held us up 3 weeks from being able to get our course out because we didn't have a number. We were developing a course that hadn't actually been taught on campus. We had plans for it to be taught on campus, but that process would take 2 years before it was ever going to be 2 years before it would ever be in a course catalog. So we were supposed to wait 2 years before we had a number and could publish it. That's just crazy. We were really worried about, well, what if we want to convert these to credit later and we make up a number and it's a fictional number and then it doesn't work in whatever scheme? What a crazy thing to spend your energy and time on when what you really want to be looking at is how can we push pedagogy. The other challenge of the 23 MOOCs that were submitted, my MOOC with Dr. Walko was the only MOOC that was an 8-week MOOC. All the rest of the MOOCs were 15 and 16 weeks. And edX had an assumption that you'd do an entire semester, which is a whole lot of work. And any of us who've done that much online interaction instructional design, we're kind of like, whoa, really? It's a little ambitious. It's a lot of ambitious. So Janet and I were the only one who said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to do 8 weeks. But all the other MOOCs started out as 15 weeks. By implementation time, they'd gotten closer to 8 to 10, something that fit the model. But when we were proposing, we didn't know these lessons. And the assumption was you'd have a course number. It would look like the folks at edX were desperately asking for, what's your syllabus? As if the syllabus actually had some kind of mapping to what we were going to do in the MOOC. So let's talk a little bit about the first MOOC. It's actually the second, but it's the first one we'll talk about today. Take Your Medicine. This was an edX MOOC, EDX Environment, formerly part of the Harvard, the whole consortium, out of our College of Pharmacy. We wanted to do 2 populations. We wanted to reach out to 2 populations, scientists and researchers who didn't understand the drug development process and help them figure out why does it matter that your formulation can't be blue because there's already a popular blue pill out there. Maybe you should do a different color. Turns out they'll be marketing things that impact what happens with the actual development of your drug. These kinds of topics, animal trials, FDA regulations, are really outside of the scope of what most researchers think about. So one goal for this course was to create an integrated development plan, get their research agendas lined up with what would happen when it was commercialized. The other thing, which we figured it's a MOOC, so why not try to do two terribly different and wonderful things at the same time, was to go after consumers. People take a lot of medicines in the U.S. A lot of them complain about what that medical structure looks like. There's lots of reason to. We wanted to expose and bring some transparency to what was really happening with the cost of drug development, with the issues of health and safety, with the role of the FDA. So we kind of had these two parallel tracks. We'd dive deep into the scientists. The researchers could watch more of the chemists and more of the commercialization process. And the public health people could watch videos on what exactly is personalized medicine and what does that mean for me. So two tracks. Here's a little bit of what the edX environment looks like. And any of you run a MOOC? I should have asked that right off. Harold. All right, we'll have to talk about that. And any of you signed up for a MOOC? I know. Any of you completed a MOOC? Raise your hands higher. Yeah, I'm much more in the Keith style of MOOC enrollment. So this is what that environment looks like. You know, frankly, I was really disappointed because to me this looked like a really fancy wrapper around YouTube. Really fancy wrapper. But that was pretty much it. And so the pedagogy side of me was like, oh, but where are the interactions? edX had shown us what they called a finger exercise. And I loved this idea of a finger exercise. They had a little circuit board beneath a video. And so blah, 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 circuit, blah, blah, blah. And then underneath it, you could play with it. You could draw out your circuit. And then you could see whether or not you actually could reproduce what the video was telling you. As a learning science person, that could be really interesting. Did they initially start playing and not listen to the video at all? Was it clear that they were random when they started interacting with the widget? Was the actual content that was coming on the video impacting what people were playing? Or did they wait, listen to the video, and then try to go do it? And what did we learn about different learners that took different paths? That would be great. Oh, I was really excited. None of that existed. There was one really nice prototype, but it still doesn't exist. So what we really had were videos. So in this course, we tried as hard as we could to kind of push what we could do inside the pedagogy, given that that's the platform that we had. We brought in 29 speakers. We brought in the head of the FDA to talk. Well, we didn't bring her in. We went to DC with a team. We brought in scientists that had worked on key therapeutics. We brought in people that were on the cutting edge of pharmaceuticals and personal medicine, all sorts of things. So this was really our way of saying, even in a classroom setting, we could bring in different lecturers every week for 15, 16 weeks, but we couldn't bring in this many people. And we couldn't capture that and then construct it in a narrative. So that's really what this class tried to do, was pull all those people together, reassemble their discussion into kind of a narrative flow, and give people different ways of traversing that narrative as shown through a lot of videos. A lot of videos. Did I show the number of videos here? Are they out of order? Yeah, so 339 videos. The College of Pharmacy was fortunate enough to have a learning resource center. They stream about 50 hours of video a week. They do a lot of continuing education. So they were well prepared to handle the editing task of this. That wasn't the case in my next MOOC with Professor Starbird, who introduced me to Keith's material originally. So in this MOOC, which Janet's launched in February, this one launched in the spring. This one had quite a few more people that attended, almost twice the number of enrollment, which we found fascinating because here Janet's MOOC was very, very much tailored towards a specific topic and in fact had lots of stay-at-home moms, lots of people personally interested in their health, and they profess this on the boards, and then lots of people who are chemists or pharmacists in their nations. So that MOOC had a much broader international population and people who had professional reasons for being interested. In this one, I still don't think we really know who those people were. We kind of do. We know that they were lifelong learners. We know that an awful lot of them were really excited about puzzles. We know that a lot of them self-professed to wanting to be better thinkers, which is a wonderful thing to hear. I mean, that's a great motivation for coming in. But that doesn't tell us much about the demographics of them, and we get kind of loose data on demographics that I'll show you some of that later. Janet's course had an 11% completion rate. This course had almost 6. Now, 11% is fantastic in MOOC terms. 6%, you can hold your head up high. It's not terrible. But I think it does go to show the difference in what was essentially a general education, much more casual learning course versus a professional development course, and speaks to Keith's point about if you're trying to follow value add where you could extract money, then professional development, the numbers really are showing that that would be a better way to go. And we got better with our surveys between each of the MOOCs as we understood those markets better. So in this one, we expressly asked why people were there, and 83% of them said that they were there for lifelong learning. Janet's MOOC had a budget of about $210,000. That was 2 different grants that we won. Those grants were to focus on the researchers and scientists and to focus on the MOOC component. So we took both of those, added them together, created the asset knowing that we would have a marketing strategy and a development strategy, a digital asset strategy towards everything that we produced and create different courses out of that. So we bundled it all together to be able to optimize our resources. This one only had the grant that came from UT System, so it didn't have the additional monies. Fewer videos, but still that's an awful lot of video. We actually shot 42 hours of videos, of which 17 made it in. 1.6 million watched. That's about 3 years, 2 months worth of video that was watched, and lots of unique videos, so unique viewers. So this one definitely had a broader audience. One of the things that was really, really tough about edX, and I think is challenging in all the platforms, but in edX specifically, was my solution is stuck. And I felt like my solution was stuck an awful lot during the process. This is essentially the forums that you get. So anybody who's spent time in forums, you have threads and you can kind of nest into threads. You don't really have that as an option within edX. They've taken a different approach towards how they're doing forums. The one thing that's really nice here is that that response is pinned inside the thread of the video. So there's video, problem, and then a discussion. And you can follow the discussion contextually with the content. And I have to give it to edX. That's a wonderful thing to be able to do. Don't make the students go out to a forum, but bring the forum into the dialogue, bring the forum into where they're actually working on the problem in the video. I like the fact that they've got it inside the context. But then once you went out to the forums, which is what this screenshot is, it was really, really hard to find it. You basically have kind of a raw Twitter feed of what's happening inside those forums. With a loose ability, there's a pull down, which was kind of hidden, and lots of people had trouble finding it. And we struggled with how much do we do videos to train people to use the edX platform versus our own pedagogy. And edX doesn't have, they've got one course, but it doesn't really give you all of the nuts and bolts. So a lot of people didn't find that feature. And made the forums almost a bulletin board of just kind of announcing. You could essentially put a flyer up on a bulletin board of what you had to say, and not so much a conversation. Different users are savvy in different ways, so some of them figured out how to have a conversation. But you would never see a conversation in our MOOCs that had more than 200 responses. And out of thousands and thousands of people, you would expect that those would be higher. And in the Canvas environment, I actually had much higher ratios. Janet's pedagogy was to bring in these 29 experts, compose a narrative, and take you through the story. Mike's was quite different. We really, really didn't want to talk about math as much as possible. We wanted it to be unintimidating. We didn't want to present a lot of formulas. We really didn't want to put out a language of glyphs and things that would make our math audience maybe shy away from the topic. So instead, the camera really was a fourth student. All 42 hours looked pretty much like this. It was Mike and 2 students. Usually one student was a math student, knew the material. One student wasn't. We never revealed which one was which, but if you watched often enough, you'd figure out, no, Marshall kind of gets this stuff. And Scott, who's you're not seeing here, Scott kind of didn't. If you watched me on any of the video, you know that I would have really, really done terrible on Monty Hall. And would not, and still to this day, after 6 hours of video shooting, I only barely think I understand why you always pick the other door in the Monty Hall story. But really what we tried to do is expose the pain of going through these problems. So we would film all of that footage with somebody solving a puzzle. And we would watch them, and you'd watch their face and their, especially mine, this anguish of And then we would take terribly wrong roads. And Mike would sit there very patiently just watching us completely botch the whole thing. Poker face, he would smile and he'd be very encouraging while we were just barrel heading down the wrong road. And then he would just give us one little intervention. I spent 2 months watching Mike teach before I realized that we really our videographer needed to be someone who understood documentaries. I needed someone who could zoom into the face of someone who was in pain, frankly, and then who made it through. I wanted to show those moments of epiphany on the screen. I didn't want to show the resolution to the problem, because most of these are classic math problems. You could Google them, and people did. What I wanted to show was that moment of realization that they understood how to solve it, and then a discussion of, well, what did you do? How did you approach the problem that changed your ability to struggle versus actually succeed with the math? So we had lots and lots of that kind of screen scenes. They always worked with paper and pen, and we would show, much like you did, we'd show on the screen how they did it. If the puzzles needed some elaboration, then we would use Camtasia to do a Khan Academy style description of the problem. We never did the solutions until the very end of the course. So you had to stick through the entire course before we posted puzzle solutions. And our TAs were extremely diligent in trying to keep puzzle solutions from showing up on the forums. As much as you coach people, they're just people who are like, oh, the answer is this. And they're so proud. And then you have to kind of try to abate that so that the conversation can be more about the challenges of solving the puzzle and not just the solution. Yeah?
Most of the budget went into the studio recording and editing?
Well, if by studio you mean Mike's house and...
Well, wherever you were filming.
Yeah, on location. And staff. So we had TAs that were math TAs that were helping us through the pedagogy. We actually developed 3 very nice interactions that we didn't use, which if I were to say there's a failure of this, it's that we weren't convinced that these beautiful interactions that we developed actually added to the understanding of Euler circuits. We thought Euler, and in fact, the TAs, we spent 3 months identifying which problems lended themselves the most to the movement of a mouse. You can illustrate all sorts of great things, and the illustrations are nice, but in which ones did it matter that you move the mouse?
One was $35,000 budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was very low tech video.
Yeah, and it makes a difference. It really does. We also produced teacher guides for this that went alongside the books. So they're materials specifically targeted towards high school and community college teachers to be able to leverage the MOOC. So that was about $40,000 of the budget. So we were really thoughtful about how we created, much like you did, digital assets that went with the course. We worked with Wiley on an integration with the textbook, the Heart of Math textbook with Wiley, and with Princeton Press for his other books. So some of it was an integration. Yeah, it's a great point. But it took us 3 months to identify which interactions would be the most interesting, and then once we had them, we were absolutely not convinced that they would actually benefit learning. And we didn't want to detract by moving the mouse. That's fun, and maybe it keeps people engaged, and engagement enhances learning. But we weren't convinced that the interactions themselves did. So A Horse of a Different Color, this is a course that I built that would have been considered a CMOOC in the very early days. We first developed it in 2010, so there weren't big MOOC platforms at the time. This course was $10,000, a lot of sweat and equity and a few interns, but they weren't paid for out of the budgets. We stole the time. Basically, we would squeeze the time inside other responsibilities, and everybody on the team had full-time other responsibilities. So this is a model where we really had a very different budget, but we used multiple modes of delivery. We put it in Canvas, and the Canvas platform was really very kind to us, supported a lot of groups, supported a lot of cohorts, supported LTI and SCORM so that we could do some more interesting things with e-learning. We developed an ebook with this that we licensed separately, and so this is the one that made money, which I think is fascinating. The one that I had a $10,000 budget is the one that actually made money. Right now, this one's still running. We run it in conjunction with countries. We have about 3,000 people that are certified. But let's talk a little bit about the pedagogy that went into this and how we did it. We used a tool called Articulate Story or Articulate Studio. Some of you may be familiar with it. In 2010, they didn't have quite as fancy a stuff as they can do now, but it was good enough for what we wanted to do. We had students from the university go on Christmas break to Ghana and to remote parts of China, and they tested the technology in their regions, so we knew we had a good low bandwidth solution. Some of the audio is me, and some of the audio is my colleagues that I thought wouldn't sound terrible on video, because I didn't have a budget to go hire anybody to do video. We actually had one video out of the entire thing, and that was the final module that was on presentations, how to deliver a good presentation. We felt that needed video. The rest we could do with audio. We certified mentors, and that's one of the more interesting things. I'll describe later kind of how that program worked. But I think it's also one of the reasons that we were able to really put a financial component behind this. And this one, I would say, was a financial success because we built it and worked with partners in the regions while we developed it. So the pilot for this course was with 500 scientists and researchers in India. It was open to all of them, so it was open in that regard. It was free because it was subsidized by the government in India. But we didn't do that in a vacuum. We didn't prepare it out of we did prepare it out of existing pedagogy, but not to take that courseware online necessarily, but to deliver it to people we'd already identified. So our market segmentation was really clear in this course, which made the business models much more clear. So if you look at those three, we have two that are classic X MOOCs, one that's arguably a C MOOC. I think there's still somewhat religious debates about what a MOOC is, but I think that roughly you could argue it's a C MOOC. Two in edX, one in Canvas. I think that your choice of a learning management system really depends on what's available in your institution, and then if you have the luxury, what pedagogy do you need? What platforms do you need to support what you want to do? The personal bias, but I think the fact that they're called learning management systems or virtual learning environments is a terrible co-option of the word learning, because there's no learning that happens in these things. They support course administration, but they really don't support learning. So I'm pretty agnostic as to platform. I will say that edX has great reach. So if you can do an edX MOOC that's on edX.org, you're going to get tremendous reach in terms of people going to the edX site every day. And in Mike's Starboard site, we had about 70 a day that were enrolling. So as a marketeer, that kind of lead generation is incredible, which drives into some of the things I'll talk about later. Vastly different funding between vastly different goals. The two edX MOOCs we've only run once. We're working on 1.5 because for Take Your Medicine, because we really wanted Take Your Medicine, which was the course component, and Make Your Medicine, which was a game component, where you actually create your own drug, and you get to experience all of this through the trials and tribulations of drug development. So we're working now on the game component, and we haven't decided yet where we'll publish it. Revenue opportunities would be probably professional development certificate fees for the College of Pharmacy. For the Math MOOC, I don't know that we really know, but we have a discussion right now about a meta MOOC, and this is basically putting together a MOOC, probably in Novo Ed, which we were talking about earlier, where we would actually pull together teachers to work on teams, and then the MOOC on edX would essentially be the laboratory. We would set up inquiry-based learning opportunities for them in that laboratory, and then that's where they would go to actually conduct experiments and bring insights into this smaller MOOC. So the smaller MOOC would be professional development fees, revenue generating. The MOOC on edX is to hopefully reach people who otherwise wouldn't look at mathematics, have them have an enjoyable mathematics experience, but then give an environment for our teachers to actually dig in a little bit into some of the experimental pedagogies. So that's kind of what we're thinking we'll do. And then the Innovation Readiness series still runs in a number of different countries. It's been translated into Russian and Spanish. And so it really runs as an ongoing project. A little bit of the difference in pedagogy, really expert narratives, and Take Your Medicine, more of a survey course. Whereas effective thinking was really inquiry-based learning, as much as we could push inquiry-based learning into that model that edX gave us. And then the Innovation Readiness is very firmly project-based. Each module has a component that's part of an overall project. You work with teams, you work with a certified vendor to complete that project. And in most of the revenue-generating ways that we deploy that course, there's actually some form of an innovation competition or an innovation review at the end of it that is your capstone from having gone through that process. So the whole pedagogy is really built on the practice of doing innovation and the work that goes along with that. So in that one, students have to go out and do market validation. They have to do IP examination of their ideas, that kind of thing. So it's much more a PBL model. All right. So Janet and I have spoken a few times on Mochanomics and kind of where are the underlying structures for this, what's, attributes to the vast difference in spend. I think production value and what you're really doing in terms of a digital asset strategy is the real differentiator between spending $250,000 on a MOOC and spending $10,000 on a MOOC. It's not about the money or your production value, but how well you understand the audience you're trying to reach and how well you can design learning experiences with what you have. So I really think that you shouldn't be daunted by hearing numbers about how crazy MOOCs are costing. These numbers do hold true. And if you're interested in kind of costing them out, I can share some of the resources that I use. But Chapman Alliance has fantastic research around what it costs to do an hour of different levels of interaction and learning that are fantastic resources, and we found them to be true in our work. Georgia Tech right now with their CS MOOC, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, Georgia Tech's actually spending about $300,000 to $400,000 per course. So those numbers can be that high, but they also come with them a lot of other things that are happening. So it's part of a greater strategy usually. The one thing that I think we don't think about too much when we're actually constructing these is, are we developing for these individual students? That's why the students are paying for the games on a subscription model, because they know that they get a feed into a perennial, evergreen, 24/7 environment where they can go and do the activities that they hired that game to do for them. I think in education we have lots of opportunities that are similar to that, that map to that, and yet we don't think of student learning experiences in terms of then how we would form the course. We tend to think of the course starting from the scaffolding of what knowledge we want. So here are the learning objectives, not necessarily from the experience side. What experience do we want them to have as they go through the learning objectives? But I think it's the experience side where we actually see sustainability. Now for something completely different. I don't want to bore you guys too much. We decided to try robot grading. Robots are terrible at this. Robots really, really, really aren't quite ready for prime time, but if you have the chance to have a robot grade thousands of papers, why not? So we took it, and this robot grading was with an essay, which was particularly intriguing because, as you mentioned, Keith, if you're doing computer science, it compiles. If there's an answer to the problem and the answer is a prime number, you can test for prime. There are things that you can do in the computer science side that makes that a really good petri dish for exploring these technologies. But if your question is something a little bit more nebulous, something that actually brings some of the experience of the students in it, if it's something that has reflection built into it, that's a much harder thing. So given the opportunity to try some machine learning and really see how would that work, I didn't exactly strong arm, but I kind of like, no, we could do it. And we chose a couple different things when we constructed the experiment. One, I'm a firm believer of more the Twitter model versus the Facebook model of experimentation. And that is experiment with your users and not on your users. Thank you, Facebook. But Facebook will just change the interface, and then they expect you to kind of catch up with them, which is terrible because Facebook is full of 40-something-year-old moms. That's just a bad thing to do to them, because my mom calls me every time they do. But what's happening over, she's maybe in her 60s, but what's happening over in the Gmail and Twitter side of the world is this kind of invitation. Come here, we're trying this little thing. Be part of this equation, be part of this experiment. And so that's how we set up the machine learning. We actually let the students know that what they were about to participate in was going to be graded in part by robots. That skews, of course, your results to some extent. That changes the bias that they would go in, and we knew that. But I was a little bit curious as to what the sentiment would be for people who knew that that was about to happen to them. Did people then skip the question? Did they opt in? Did it reflect in their answers? And what we discovered is that pharmacy students actually liked and were trusting of the machine grading. They were excited about it. I find that to be an interesting thing, that they were actually, and we did surveys of other courses that also used the machine language, and the pharmacy students were more comfortable with the technology. So I think that's an important element as we get into machine learning and using this kind of artificial intelligence to grade, is whether or not the students feel like there's parity and whether or not they feel like they're getting real feedback if it's not a real person. So it was surprisingly accurate. Let me show you the question that we asked. So we had just shown them a bunch of videos about how people are really terrible at taking their medicine. That they'll take, they'll get a course of antibiotics and they only take a few of them. Or take as directed, it says right there, take as directed, and they don't take it with water, which means when it gets into your system, there's nothing to help absorb it. So there are reasons that the pharmacists say take as directed, and they have those directions. But most people, and adherence is a big issue. So we had all of these videos about those issues, and then we asked them to kind of reflect on it. We gave them cues as to the length that we expected to see. We asked them for something specific in that. So if you think 5 to 7 sentences and 3 consequences, that's a few sentences, 1 sentence for each consequence, an intro and an outro. So we were trying to guide them without scripting them, which is a little hard to do. The biggest piece here was really, I think, how we positioned it and where we put it in the course. So this was in week 7. Students that had stayed with us this long were really engaged in the course, and so we had a very, very high response rate out of it. We also used 2 different forms of grading. One was pure machine learning. So we had all of the responses, and then we wrote up a rubric, but the rubric wasn't used in the pure machine learning, the holistic learning. Instead, what it did is it analyzed the faculty's responses. So Janet went in and she basically calibrated 200 responses and gave them scores, and then the machine used those scores to then determine what it would give to the other tests. There were 4 points in the rubric, and they could score up to 8 points on the 4 different topics that were covered in the rubric. Then we had a rubric-based, where the rubric was sitting right there, and the machine could map to the rubric for specific key phrases and keywords. So we found that the rubrics were very challenging. I have friends that are faculty that won't ever, ever, ever do a rubric. Faculty here, do you use rubrics? K through 12 in the U.S., they totally use rubrics. My children go to a project-based high school. There's rubrics for everything. The kids use the rubrics as their benchmark for understanding how they're going to get the grades they want. So it's the expectation and goal setting for the students is inside that rubric. I think rubrics are a very interesting tool. But if you're not used to using rubrics and this is new, then it is really a skill that you have to develop. Imagine taking that essay and then putting into a matrix what a good answer and a fair answer and a poor answer would be, and then trying to describe in something that a robot would then be able to parse and understand and apply to a bunch of other responses. Not trivial. So we actually were fortunate enough to have a team of learning scientists at the University of Texas. They examined those rubrics for us. They helped us refine it. They helped us understand, much like good survey instruments or any of those other kind of classic good social science things, there are traps and messes in there if you don't really know what you're doing. So I think that leaves a lot in terms of technology opportunity for the systems like edX to facilitate in the development of good rubrics, to help the faculty member that are working in those systems understand what makes a good rubric, and especially what makes a good rubric in the context of how they're going to use rubrics for peer and machine learning later on. And I really do think that the platforms need to take on that responsibility, that the pedagogies are too different, and that how that gets implemented alongside the grading is going to be too idiosyncratic to the platform to just say, we don't have to worry about that, faculty know how to do it. I think it's more an obligation on their part, my humble opinion. I think that engaging the faculty and creating those is really key. We thought that we could develop rubrics with TAs because TAs grade a lot of things, but it turns out that a lot of the nuance in a response, so this response is right, but it's not quite right because then they said that crazy thing. The TAs didn't always get the dissonance with the crazy thing. So that's the kind of thing where if you get the faculty directly engaged with the TAs, it's a good position. We ran specific tests on language. We were very concerned that in edX, and especially in Janet's course, which had lots of students outside of the U.S., that English as a second language was going to adversely impact how the machine graded them, and it did. So what we discovered, though, is that it looks like a lot of those students were going to Google Translate or other popular translators to translate their definition. So now, if we were to go back and run it again, we would actually populate in the calibration the translation from the native language. So at a university like UT Austin, we're kind of blessed in that if I want a student that's Norwegian, if I want a student that's speaking Mandarin, if I want a student that speaks Hindi, I can find those students and I can bring them in to actually say, well, how would you respond to this, get the right response, get a translation, and then do that calibration. But that's because I have a large international campus and those resources are all over the place. I think this is a really unique challenge for campuses that don't have access to the multilingual students. And we found that there was actually a surprisingly high amount of agreement with the two elements of scoring. So the holistic, where it just looked at Janet's response and calibration and then matched it up, was at about 74%, whereas the rubric was a little higher at 79%. Now, those two things happened in the same course. So Janet's scoring on the holistic side was influenced by the way she scored on the rubrics side, so there's a skew there. And the developer of the machine learning stopped working at edX kind of midway through, so we didn't get a lot of feedback as to how to refine our use of the holistic. But that's not such a big delta that we'd be really worried about it. All right, new topic. One of the things that I think is really, really powerful inside of MOOCs is a changing role amongst what's happening in online education for mentors. And one of the reasons that the Innovation Readiness series was such a powerful economic engine, in the first 7 months after we released it as a course, working with governments in a bunch of different regions, we had made about $250,000 in licensing. Now, most of that were licensing either for the ebook, so that was a model where embassies would purchase the ebook for a large population and they got access to the course, or models where the course themselves would actually pull together. But this is a view of the 50 mentors throughout Russia, and so we used the course as a very deliberate way of certifying these mentors and of bringing them into an environment where they could really, really work together. So I think of this as true capacity building. We're not just streaming and broadcasting, but we're bringing that down to individual people in the region that can use the material. Later I can show you interesting stuff on MOOCs and learning data, but I think the vaudeville cane is like going to pull me off the stage. So before I go, I do want to mention one thing about the ability for MOOCs to harness data. And here, this is a company that's a partner of ours in Austin that's using traditional data, enrollment data, LMS data, admissions data, and starting to do heat maps. The students here in blue are going to do fine in this course. The students here in red aren't. And that's based on a lot of data that's input. Now that we have MOOCs and we're starting to get bigger repositories for data, we're going to get much more interesting ways of visualizing and then facilitating what's happening with students who are at risk. And I think that if you're questioning what's really happening with MOOCs, it's this kind of data. And frankly, this is not wonderful data to work with. Most LMSs are only as rich as the faculty put that stuff into Blackboard. If they use the forums, then I've got that data. If they didn't, I don't. So it's idiosyncratic across faculty. It's idiosyncratic across institutions. So I think there's a lot of work to do in this, but this is the direction where some of that analytics is going. And they're awfully pretty. It's really interesting to see some of the information that you get. Yeah, let's go to this one. Georgia Tech's doing interesting stuff. We can talk about that on a boat because we're in Norway. But just to sum up, these are the kinds of things that I think we should be looking at for the emerging roles for MOOCs, many of which were things that Keith mentioned. So I'll just highlight recruiting. My children are looking at colleges, and so my daughter is attending MOOCs at colleges of interest where she might want to go. And she's been doing this for about a year. Leading up to the summer, we'll go to college tours. She's ruled out Wesleyan. Great course. She learned a lot of stuff, but by the end of the course, she wasn't really as jazzed about the material as she thought she would be going in. So she's actually using this to test drive the faculty at institutions where she thinks she might want to get a learning experience. So that kind of drives back to this notion that the MOOCs can be about raising awareness for your faculty, raising awareness for your areas of expertise. And I don't know that you need lots of money and that you need to put a high production value in it, but you need to be genuine and support your faculty in actually doing things that are really good articulations and really good expressions, even if they're low bandwidth, of what that experience would be like. Because I think this will happen more and more. We'll have students from all over the world who get to taste test different pedagogies, different experiences, before they decide that they're going to go and invest their time and money towards it. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you're welcome.